Hello again, this is Eric Anthony Crew, and I'm here today to talk to you about sacred geometry. Sacred geometry, don't get scared, has a little bit to do with math, but a lot more to do with reality. Everything in reality, everything that has manifested itself or that has been manifested by something else, has done so through the shape and form of sacred geometry. There is nothing that you could possibly think of or do that is not also a part of sacred geometry in some way. From matter and energy to the wave pattern of emotion, sacred geometry is in all things. It's what makes up the architecture of everything, living and non-living. It is even responsible for the very system of linguistics that allows me the function to speak to you today. So, what is sacred geometry exactly? Sacred geometry is a type of mathematics that, if properly studied and translated, can be used to literally explain reality in a universal language, one that I will demonstrate later exactly how any life form can use these shapes, not only to understand humanity, but to communicate with us all together. In my first segment, the fear of truth and the death of the ego, I discussed how there are really only two known universal truths, that of fear and that of love. However, I intentionally left out a key examination of certain a priori truths, or truths that can only be known by the mind and thus not experienced in the physical. I am referring to, of course, of the realm of mathematics and science. It is my opinion that science, and by extension the mathematics that we use to quantify it, are both very fallible, as they are constantly being proven or disproven and even blown completely out of the water every time we introduce the equation into the quantum world. So, to be fair, some will of course argue that the law of excluded middle states that there are no gray areas in mathematics, and thus 2 plus 2 will always equal out to be 4. And so math must be an infallible form of universal truth. I actually agree with the logic of the statement. However, once we introduce the mechanics of the system into the realm of quantum physics, we again find a paradox that just doesn't quite add up. Even the law of excluded middle can become the gray area it was never intended or allowed to be. To elaborate, the number 1 is quantifiable by a unit of measurement, and the smallest unit of measurement that is scientifically accepted is that of the atom, the smallest unit of life that displays all the necessary functions thereof. And while I'm sure that we have found smaller and ever will so, for this segment I am stopping here to illustrate a point. If an atom, just one atom, is the basis for the number 1, by mere extension of measurements, and yet an atom can be found to be in more than one place at any given time and is actually in at least 2 different places simultaneously at any given moment, then is there really such a thing as the number 1? Perhaps not. If the smallest unit of measurement itself cannot be held to be true in its own quantification at all times, then we must also throw out its definition as a reliable source of truth. So, returning to geometry, I have found that the only gray areas are that of incomplete shapes and inaccurate angles or lines. Therefore, a triangle will always be a triangle so long as it has 3 sides connecting each side, and a square will always be a square so long as there are 4 equal lines connecting to one another, and so on. Even though the size of the shapes or lines used may differ, the angles, degrees, and lines needed to create the geometrical patterns will always remain the same. So, to conclude my examination, it is in mathematics that we may quantify and thus measure out the geometry we observe, but even if our units of measurement change, whether a new one is introduced or we just continue to build upon older models, the shapes of geometry will always remain constant, and so we have now been able to identify yet another example of a universal truth. The origins of sacred geometry and humanity's knowledge of it goes back to the earliest records ever found. Some in temples, some inscribed on walls, and yet it is the same image all over the world, with little to no explanation on how to interpret it. This is the image that was found over and over and over again. This is called the seed of life. The seed of life is actually a geometrical code meant to inspire those with minds capable of fathoming its architecture to realize that it isn't complete. As with most images in sacred geometry, the seed of life contains a hidden message, or rather a hidden equation. If you continue with the pattern left for the illuminated minds that discover this, you will actually end up with an even more divine image, one that was also revered and protected in ancient times. This symbol is known as the flower of life. A simplistically made yet profoundly complicated structure of interlocking circles and shapes that can actually answer all of the mysteries that sacred geometry has to offer. If we are to examine the core of the flower of life, we get this shape, known as the fruit of life. This structure of 13 circles creates one of the most mind-blowing images and equations known to man, one that is still has most sacred geometry scholars stumped and unable to move on from. That is the structure known as Metatron's cube. Metatron was once considered to be the scribe of the gods in certain Judeo-Christian texts, and is thus the equivalent to Thoth Hermes of ancient Egyptian and Babylon. The scribe of the gods would have to have a clear understanding of the universe and how it works in order to write about creation, and thus must have had a divine understanding of sacred geometry. To create Metatron's cube out of the fruit of life, you must interconnect each of the centers of the circles with straight lines, and you end up getting this image. To conclude, there are 5 platonic solids that literally make up all forms and shapes, meaning all life forms and structures fit into one of these in some way, and even engineers must learn these shapes in order to build a structurally sound design. 3 of these platonic solids are found easily in Metatron's cube, which is the tetrahedron, the hexahedron, and the octahedron, all of which fit perfectly into the Metatron's cube. However, the remaining 2 solids, the dodecahedron and the icosahedron, both require extra lines to be added in order to complete their shaping from the cube. 6 extra lines are required to fit the dodecahedron, and yet there is supposedly no way to fit the icosahedron at all without adding more flower of life structures to the equation. And that is what I believe to be the point of Metatron's cube, to suggest that there is no micro world without the macro, and that there is no real end or beginning. And not only are we all connected in many profound and remarkable ways, but that there are actually ways of understanding it all, if you just allow yourself the patience and presence of mind. To end this segment, I would like to illustrate exactly how to create the flower of life, and by doing so, I believe some will see an interesting comparison to Gnostic texts and even some biblical references if one is keen on the root allegories. So, we first start with a single point, or as some would call it, the logos, or word of God. From this single point comes a certain mitosis, or division, representing duality. We now have point A and point B. To create motion, we will move point B in a radius, an arc around point A, which will create a perfect circle. And now we do the exact same thing, but this time to point A. We rotate it around point B, and we now get one of the most ancient symbols known to man, called the Vesica Pisces, which represents the divine feminine, or the vagina. It is also called the Pisces or fish because of the Jesus fish symbol that is formed in its womb. This is why you will commonly see this image associated with feminine products, such as the Chanel symbol, amongst many. To continue, we now have 2 circles of common radius, and this actually gives us 4 points to draw from. After adding the radius and arc for all 4, we get this, which, as you can now see, forms the seed of life. Spiraling outwards, we will eventually get this, the fully formed and fully functional flower of life. There are so many amazing things that life has to offer, and even more secrets and truths that are waiting to be discovered. It is my hope that we will all embrace the coming mental ascension that most feel humanity is far overdue for, and will thus begin to explore the regions of space, both inner and outer, together on this journey, until we all learn that the betterment of everyone truly means the betterment of you. Thank you, and have a blessed day.